March 1945. The sky above Iwo Jima was the color of ash and engine smoke, a low gray overcast that pressed down on the island like a lid, sealing the heat and the smell of sulfur and burning fuel into the narrow airspace where men were still dying in numbers that the dispatches struggled to convey with accuracy. The island itself, 8 square miles of volcanic rock and black sand that the Japanese garrison had been fortifying for years, had been declared secured by American ground forces, though secured was a word that the Marines using it understood to carry significant qualifications. The tunnels were still occupied. The resistance was still organized. And in the airspace above and around the island, Japanese airmen flying observation, resupply, and attack missions were encountering something attached to American aircraft that did not correspond to any category of aerial weaponry their training had prepared them to face. It was not a bomb in the conventional sense. It was not a gun. It was fire, deliberate, projected, sustained fire, delivered from the air with a precision and an intimacy that transformed the nature of the threat entirely. It was the airborne flamethrower, and the men who flew toward it and survived to report what they had seen used language in their after-action accounts that the Imperial military's clinical reporting style could barely contain. To understand the shock that registered in those accounts, one must first understand what Japanese airmen believed they understood about the limits of aerial weaponry in the spring of 1945. By that point in the war, the Imperial Air Services had accumulated nearly 4 years of combat experience across every major theater of the Pacific conflict. Their aviators had fought over China, over the Indian Ocean, over the Coral Sea and the Solomon Islands, over the Philippine Sea and the skies of the home islands themselves. They had faced American fighters, American bombers, American anti-aircraft fire in its conventional and proximity-fused forms. They had developed, through that accumulated experience, a working model of what American aircraft could and could not do, a model that was, by 1945, increasingly grim in its assessment of American capability, but that still contained certain fixed assumptions about the categories of threat that aerial platforms could deliver. Bombs fell. Rockets fired. Guns fired. These were the instruments of aerial warfare. They operated at range, through velocity, through the physics of projectiles moving through air. Fire was a ground weapon. Fire was what you encountered when you were on the surface, in the tunnels, in the bunkers. Fire did not come from aircraft, until it did. The development of airborne flamethrower systems by the United States military was not, in the historical record, a sudden inspiration. It was the product of a sustained and pragmatic response to the specific tactical problem that the Pacific Island campaigns had created. The problem of fortified positions that conventional weapons could suppress, but not destroy, that could absorb extraordinary quantities of high explosive and continue to function, that required the attacker to come close and then closer still before the defender could be neutralized. The Japanese tunnel and bunker systems encountered on Tarawa, on Peleliu, on Saipan, and on Iwo Jima itself were engineering achievements of genuine sophistication. They had been designed by officers who understood that American firepower would be overwhelming and who had therefore built their defenses not to resist that firepower, but to survive beneath it, deep enough, dispersed enough, connected enough by underground passages to allow defenders to reoccupy positions after bombardment had passed, and to continue fighting from prepared ground against attackers who had assumed the position was neutralized. Against this kind of defense, conventional aerial ordnance was useful but insufficient. What was needed was something that could follow the defender into his position, that could deny the tunnel and the bunker the protection their depth was designed to provide. What was needed, the engineers and tacticians concluded, was fire delivered with precision from a platform that could place it exactly where it was required. The technical path to the airborne flamethrower ran through the Marine Corps and the Army's Chemical Warfare Service, through the engineers of the National Defense Research Committee, and through the practical experience of ground flamethrower operators who had used their weapons on every major island campaign, and who understood, with the authority of men who had done the work personally, both the devastating effectiveness of the weapon and its significant limitations when employed from the ground. A man carrying a flamethrower on his back was a man who had to approach his target through fire, through enemy fire, through terrain that the defender had prepared specifically to prevent that approach. The casualty rates among flamethrower operators were severe. The weapon worked, but the cost of employing it was measured in the lives of the men who carried it close enough to use it. If the weapon could be mounted on an aircraft, if the fire could be delivered from above, from a platform that moved faster than any ground defender could track, and that could approach the target from angles that ground-based emplacements could not cover, the tactical calculus would change fundamentally. The systems that emerged from this development process were mounted primarily on modified versions of existing American aircraft, most notably the TBM Avenger torpedo bomber, which was adapted to carry napalm-based flamethrower systems that could be discharged in sustained bursts during low-level attack runs. Napalm itself was a relatively recent development, having been formulated by researchers at Harvard University in 1942 through a collaboration between the chemistry department and the Chemical Warfare Service. Its properties were, from a military perspective, exceptionally well suited to the airborne delivery problem. It was thicker than conventional fuel, which meant it adhered to surfaces rather than splashing and dispersing. It burned longer, and it could be delivered in a controlled stream rather than as a dispersed aerosol. The combination of napalm with a purpose-designed aerial delivery system produced a weapon that could lay a sustained stream of burning fuel across a target area with a precision that earlier incendiary methods could not approach. The aircraft did not drop fire from altitude. It flew low, very low, in some operational profiles barely above the treetops, and directed the fire along a specific axis into a specific opening against a specific position with the targeting judgment of a pilot who could see exactly what he was attacking. 4 Japanese airmen who observed these attacks from the air, flying escort, observation, or their own attack missions in the same operational areas where American flamethrower aircraft were operating. The visual experience was recorded in terms that went beyond tactical assessment. The accounts described the low approach of the American aircraft, the characteristic silhouette of the modified Avenger dropping toward a target that from altitude appeared no different from any other fortified position, and then the sudden projection of fire. Not the brief flash of an explosive detonation, but a sustained, directed stream of orange and black that clung to its target and continued burning after the aircraft had already pulled away and was climbing back to altitude. The fire did not behave like the fire of bombs or rockets. It persisted. It followed contours. It entered spaces that blast could not reach, and it burned with a thoroughness that left nothing in its path in a condition that could continue functioning. The psychological dimension of this experience was documented by Japanese military medical and psychological officers in reports that the post-war translation and analysis effort eventually made available to Western historians. The reports identified, with the careful clinical language of military medicine, a pattern of response among airmen who had observed or been in proximity to airborne flamethrower attacks that differed from the responses documented after conventional bombing or strafing. Conventional weapons produced fear, disorientation, the physiological responses associated with near-death experience, and the witnessing of casualties. These were responses that the training system had anticipated and had attempted to prepare men to manage through the cultivation of discipline, of gammon, of the warrior's capacity to function inside the experience of danger without being functionally destroyed by it. The airborne flamethrower produced something additional, a response that the clinical language of the reports approached but never quite named directly, that sat between tactical shock and something more primitive and harder to train away. Fire from the air violated a category boundary that the human nervous system, regardless of cultural preparation, recognized as fundamental. Fire was supposed to be on the ground. Fire was supposed to be something you could move away from, something that obeyed the physical constraints of its fuel and its oxygen. Fire that came from above, that was directed with intention, that adhered and persisted. This was something that the prepared warrior's psychological framework had not fully accounted for. The Imperial Japanese Air Services attempted, through the latter months of 1945, in the planning stages that the war's end would interrupt before they could be executed, to develop tactical responses to the airborne flamethrower threat. The responses considered included modified interception profiles designed to engage flamethrower aircraft before they completed their attack runs, adjustments to ground position design intended to reduce the weapon's effectiveness against tunnel openings, and the exploration of Japanese equivalents that might be deployed against American positions. None of these responses reached operational maturity before August 1945. The weapon had been introduced into the Pacific Air War at a point when Japan's capacity to absorb new tactical challenges and develop effective countermeasures had been so degraded by attrition, by fuel shortages, by the depletion of experienced personnel, and by the relentless pressure of American operations that the institutional machinery required to mount a serious response was no longer fully functional. The shock registered. The reports were filed. The countermeasures were planned. And the war ended before any of it could be tested. The canteen of American aviation fuel, that mundane, prosaic container of a substance so abundant in the American logistical system that it appeared wherever American aircraft operated, in quantities that Japanese supply officers regarded with a mixture of professional envy and genuine strategic despair, carried in the context of the airborne flamethrower as symbolism that exceeded its practical function. Napalm was, at its foundation, a fuel, a refined and thickened fuel, but a fuel nonetheless, a product of the same petrochemical abundance that kept American aircraft flying around the clock, that powered the carriers and the landing craft and the trucks and the generators of a military establishment that had never, in 4 years of global war, been genuinely constrained by the availability of energy. Japan had gone to war in 1941 partly because of oil, because the American embargo had threatened the fuel supply that its military required to function, because the territories of Southeast Asia contained the petroleum reserves that could replace what the embargo denied. The irony that played out across the Pacific campaigns was that the nation which had gone to war for fuel had spent that war watching its enemy deploy fuel in quantities and in applications that its own logistical system could not approach. The fire that came from American aircraft was, in a literal and not merely metaphorical sense, the fire of abundance. The fire of a nation that had so much of what the war required that it could afford to burn it in streams from the wings of aircraft flying low over Pacific islands, in sustained and deliberate acts of destruction that a fuel-constrained military could never have sustained. The transformation that the airborne flamethrower produced in Japanese military thinking was not limited to its immediate tactical implications. It extended into the broader reassessment of American capability and intention that the accumulated shocks of 1944 and 1945 were forcing upon those Japanese officers who were capable of honest analysis. The weapon represented something that went beyond its destructive function. It represented the willingness of American military science and industry to pursue any technical solution to any tactical problem, regardless of the moral or psychological categories that the solution violated, and to pursue it with the organized efficiency of a system that did not run short of ideas, of materials, or of the productive capacity to translate ideas into hardware and hardware into operational deployment. The airborne flamethrower was not a weapon that a conservative, resource-constrained military establishment would have developed and deployed. It was a weapon that required the confidence of abundance, the confidence of a nation that believed it could afford to experiment, to modify, to equip, and to train, and that would not be stopped by the novelty or the psychological weight of what it was doing. In the years after the war, Japanese aviators who survived the Pacific campaigns and contributed to the oral history and memoir literature of that conflict returned occasionally to the subject of the airborne flamethrower with a specificity that distinguished it from other weapons in their recollections. Other American weapons were remembered in the language of tactical assessment. The Hellcat's speed advantage, the proximity fuse's unsettling effectiveness, the sheer numerical weight of American carrier air groups. The airborne flamethrower was remembered in a different register, in a language of an experience that had reached past the tactical and touched something more fundamental, something about the nature of the war itself and the nature of the civilization conducting it. It was fire. It came from the sky, and the sky, which had once been simply the medium through which aircraft moved and fought, became with that weapon something more complex, a dimension of the battlefield from which almost anything, it now appeared, could come. Freedom, in the end, does not announce its weapons in advance. It develops them in laboratories and machine shops and on the flight decks of carriers, in the unglamorous collaboration of engineers and pilots and supply officers who are trying to solve a specific problem with whatever tools their civilization's abundance makes available. The fire that came from American aircraft over the Pacific Islands in 1945 was not a gesture of cruelty, though cruelty was present in that war as it is present in all wars. It was a gesture of problem-solving, the organized, determined, resource-backed problem-solving of a democratic nation that had decided to end a war and was applying everything it had to that objective. The Japanese airmen who saw that fire and felt the shock of its category violation were not wrong to be shocked. They were encountering, in one of its most visceral forms, the truth that a free civilization at war is capable of reaching. The truth that abundance does not merely feed armies, but arms them, does not merely sustain campaigns, but invents the instruments of their conclusion, and does not stop inventing until the problem is solved and the fire, at last, goes out.